The House will be in order.
Mr. Speaker, the process for considering our first bill of the 118th Congress reflects our commitment to Americans and an open legislative process. Now let's focus on what this bill does. It repeals the vast majority of the Internal Revenue Service funding Democrats enacted last year in order to pay for their Green New Deal. The primary purpose of that funding is hiring more auditors and support staff to vastly expand IRS's audit capacity, and not just audits on wealthy Americans. With that expanded capacity, IRS can bring in more revenue by auditing more middle and lower income families and more small businesses. Families and small businesses are struggling under the weight of record inflation and supply chain shortages. Small businesses are struggling to find workers at any wage. The overwhelming majority of Americans, about 85%, follow the law and pay their taxes. The last thing they need is more IRS agents knocking on doors to conduct audits. Yet this IRS funding is part of the broad Biden administration strategy to tax and audit exponentially more Americans by looking into their bank accounts, requiring online payment services to report them when they split a dinner check with friends or pay their babysitter after a night out, and then target them using 87,000 new IRS employees. Americans deserve to know their government is working for them, not against them.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today, and I thank the gentleman from Nebraska. I rise today in support of the Family Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act, one of the first legislative acts of the new Republican majority. Main Street America has suffered 2 years too many of Democrat one-party rule. Inflation continues to hover at record highs, and small businesses continue to struggle. The last thing that these small businesses can afford right now is 87,000 new IRS agents not only targeting their enterprises, but targeting their livelihoods. With 11 million tax returns still awaiting IRS action, the IRS should be focusing on doing their job rather than weaponizing their agency. This isn't new. The Democrats have used IRS and the tax code as a weapon before and are attempting to do it again. The Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act rescinds new IRS funding intended to target middle-class families. This cannot wait. I urge passage of this bill so our small businesses can thrive, absent any fear of IRS agents knocking at their door. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in full support of H.R. 23, which rescinds the additional funding for the already inflated IRS. I think we can all agree that the last thing Americans need right now is a government who is actively working against them. One of the most outrageous provisions in the Democrats' so-called Inflation Reduction Act was giving the IRS $72 billion taxpayer dollars to hire 87,000 additional agents, whose job would be to stalk transactions of everyday Americans and attack small businesses. Middle-class Americans and the small businesses that fuel our economy have been unable to catch a break over the last 2 years. That ends today. There's simply no reasonable rationale to make the IRS larger than the Pentagon, State Department, FBI, and Border Control together. If we're adding an additional 87,000 agents, why don't we send them to the southern border to help our border agents who are already overwhelmed and understaffed? I stand with my colleagues today in support of H.R. 23 to block the intrusive and unnecessary 87,000 new IRS agents. Americans deserve a government that will work for them, and stopping this funding is a first step in the right direction. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased today to rise in support of common sense legislation that puts the American people ahead of padding the coffers of the IRS. It wasn't long ago that Washington was under one-party rule. This chamber was recently under the leadership of the Democrat Party that worked to give D.C. bureaucrats more power and wanted to hire an army of IRS agents to harass and audit my constituents while ignoring the need for more border agents to address the crisis at our southern border. Congressman Smith's legislation eliminates the devastating IRS provision that Democrats snuck into their so-called Inflation Reduction Act by rescinding the funding to this D.C. agency. The facts are that middle and lower income people are audited more by IRS agents by design of the IRS. The Kansans I represent need relief from high gas prices and rampant inflation caused by the current administration and one-party rule. My constituents don't need a supercharged IRS that will investigate their transaction between friends and sic 87,000 new agents on them. The bill, as the first bill that the new Congress addresses, puts our priorities on full display. Republicans are ready to restore our nation and hold our government accountable. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Nebraska. House Republicans made a promise to the American people to fight for working-class families. And we made a promise that our first order of business under a new Republican majority would be repeal the $80 billion Democrats gave the IRS to hire 87,000 new agents to target American working-class families. We are delivering on that promise today. This bill rescinds the IRS funds in the Inflation Reduction Act, a law that does nothing to combat inflation, but everything to empower an agency that has targeted Americans. They've leaked taxpayer information, and under the Biden administration, they threaten to snoop into the bank accounts of millions of middle-class families. We know this because President Biden wrote such a proposal into his first budget as part of his agenda to expand the power of the IRS and shovel billions more to this troubled agency. At that time, we asked the Joint Committee on Taxation how many Americans might be subject to such a scheme to spy into the bank accounts. The JCT said up to 134 million taxpayers could be targeted. So much for just going after the millionaires and the billionaires that our Democrat colleagues like to talk about. And while the Biden administration, including Treasury Secretary Yellen, has tried to dismiss concerns over how middle-class Americans would be targeted by the IRS under the Democrats' $80 billion infusion of cash, the Congressional Budget Office has affirmed that undoubtedly families making less than $400,000 per year would be subjected to increased enforcement and, yes, audits by the IRS. But of course, this would be the case when you realize that more than half of the $80 billion Democrats gave the IRS is earmarked for enforcement. The IRS does not need a raise. It needs a reckoning. And what starts today with rescinding this $80 billion continues through rigorous IRS oversight that Democrats ignored under the one-party rule. Taxpayers deserve true oversight for an agency that leaked the tax returns of thousands of American taxpayers at the same time the White House was calling for tax increases on those individuals. We are talking about an agency with a history of targeting conservatives, with woefully underperforming customer service, and whose own commissioner under Obama called this $80 billion more than 3 times the amount of money the agency actually needed. House Republicans are ready to provide oversight and accountability, and that starts today with ending this $80 billion pay raise. I yield back.
I thank my friend from Nebraska for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act. This bill defends American taxpayers against an unchecked, supercharged IRS and prioritizes customer service and tax return processing, 2 of the agency's most important functions. Included in the Democrats' Reckless Inflation Reduction Act this past summer, the IRS received an additional $80 billion in funding, with over half directed towards enforcement. What's worse, the Democrats' bill failed to include any safeguards to protect low and middle-income taxpayers from being unfairly targeted for tax audits. While the IRS continues to beef up their audit division, the agency still has 3.7 million unprocessed tax returns and a total of 11.1 million returns awaiting action. This is simply unacceptable. The IRS should focus on processing these returns, along with addressing the awful level of customer service currently available to taxpayers. Law-abiding families and small businesses in Illinois need their tax returns processed and phone calls answered, not more IRS agents knocking on their doors with burdensome audits. I urge the adoption of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I rise today in support of the Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act. This new Republican majority is focused on protecting taxpayers and small businesses from overreach and abuse. Blocking the Biden administration from unleashing 87,000 new IRS agents on taxpayers is a crucial first step towards fulfilling our commitment to America. This legislation will prohibit the IRS from using new funds to target lower and middle class families and small businesses with more burdensome and intrusive audits. As households grapple with the struggling economy, the last thing they need is more harassment from a supercharged IRS. Republicans are unified in our effort to bring economic relief to Americans, not more government overreach and hardship. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and stop the administration's weaponizing of the IRS. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague from Nebraska for yielding time. Mr. Speaker, on March 1st, 2022, President Biden made a promise to the American people during the State of the Union address before a joint session of Congress. I was sitting in this room as the President stated, in quote, "Under my plan, nobody earning less than $400,000 a year will pay an additional penny in new taxes. Nobody," end quote. Mr. Speaker, the President lied to us all, because in August of 22, CBO confirmed that the Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act, which supercharges the IRS with 87,000 new agents, will in fact lead to more audits and enforcement measures and higher taxes for families making less than $400,000 a year. In fact, the CBO confirmed that lower and middle income taxpayers would see as many as 710,000 more audits. Americans are suffering under harmful inflation caused by the irresponsible fiscal policy from President Biden and our congressional Democrats. The last thing the American people need is burdensome IRS audits. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill to make Joe Biden's promise come true. I yield back.
I rise in support of the Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act. The last 2 years under Democrat rule have resulted in terrible policies and more unnecessary taxes for the American people. Americans have been feeling the weight of destructive policies since their first day in power, and now it's time for our Republican majority to fix this mess. The pressure on American taxpayers has continued to increase since the passage of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, when they gave $80 billion of new funding for the IRS to hire the 87,000 new agents to needlessly audit families and small businesses who are forced to fund the out-of-control spending and misguided Green New Deal priorities. How do more audits and scrutiny from the IRS benefit hardworking Americans? Liberals in Congress chose to target American taxpayers by supercharging the IRS, which solely focuses on auditing the hardworking Americans who already pay more than their fair share. This is unacceptable and must be reversed. Through the Inflation Reduction Act, Democrats used the tools of the IRS as a means to increase reckless spending. Yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the Family and Small Business Taxpayers Protection Act, and I'm proud to co-lead this important legislation with my friend Congressman Adrian Smith from Nebraska. As millions of American families across the country struggle to afford basic goods from food to fuel, in large part thanks to the inflation brought on by the absurd spending blowouts of the last 2 years, the very last thing that taxpayers need is a bloated and weaponized IRS. Unfortunately, that is exactly what they got when the administration rammed through $80 billion to hire 87,000 new IRS agents to harass and spy on middle-class and low-income families with most of 1.2 new additional audits. The agency needs reform and modernization, but that's not what these bills and taxpayers' dollars did. Of the $80 billion, only $3.2 billion was set aside for taxpayer services. Meanwhile, new audits and enforcement got $45 billion. The IRS's job is to serve taxpayers, not target them. That's why we must pass today's bill, which will rescind the IRS funding for enforcement while leaving in place the funding for improvements to customer service and technology. Californians and all Americans deserve an accountable government and strong economy. An accountable government is one of the serve its citizens, not one that empowers bureaucrats to target taxpayers. And we will never build an economy that is strong by weaponizing government agencies to cripple small businesses and employers. I urge all my colleagues to support an accountable government and a strong economy to vote yes on this legislation to empower American families, support small businesses, and protect taxpayers.
Gentlelady's time has
Thank you,
expired.
and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we begin the work to reform our government to work better for the American people and not against them. So what do I mean by that? The last 2 years, Democrats have had control of the White House and Senate, and they have passed and attempted historic spending provisions. But in order to do that, you have to raise revenue. And this bill became a ploy to leverage the IRS to be able to essentially do that without directly raising taxes. That's what we're talking about here. I represent thousands of IRS employees. They're some of the best, most hardworking people in my entire district. And as I talk to them, they care about two major things: customer service, and the technology needs to be improved. And that's what I love about this bill, because that keeps that in here. And we actually want to focus our spending to be able to directly support them. And so as we put forth this bill, we are sincerely trying to take what all of our constituents have been saying. We need the IRS to have more support on customer service and technology. And that's why I urge everybody to vote yes on this bill. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of the Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act. I'm a small manufacturing business owner, and I've also worked as a tax attorney, so I know firsthand the kind of power that the IRS has over our small business owners and lower and middle income taxpayers. Last year, to fund their left-wing agenda, the Democrats in Congress decided to spend your hard-earned tax dollars on 87,000 new IRS agents, making the IRS the size nearly of the U.S. Marine Corps. The Biden administration claims these agents will not set their sights on hardworking Americans. The facts reveal the opposite. The Democrats claim these new audits will only affect Americans making over $400,000. The facts prove otherwise. However, the investment of $80 billion, with over $40 billion being spent for enforcement, this will exact just a fraction of the revenue they hope to get to fund their spending freeze. The spending sprees. The American taxpayers deserve better. The truth is their plan will target hardworking middle and lower income taxpayers. The CBO agrees, and a release finding that says additional agents will lead to as many as 700,000 more audits, Americans making less than $75,000 a year. The core principle of our system is innocent until proven guilty, not guilty until proven innocent, as the IRS attempts to do. I encourage my colleagues to vote for H.R. 23.
Time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I want to clarify what exactly this bill is doing. Last year, Congress gave an additional $80 billion to the IRS on top of $12 billion of existing funding, which increased the IRS budget by almost 8 times. This bill still keeps almost $10 billion in additional funding to modernize IRS, which is still almost doubling their $12 billion budget, but eliminates over $70 billion of wasteful and egregious aggression against the American taxpayer by the federal government. As someone who spent over a decade in public accounting and also started my own businesses, I never felt that we don't have enough government. On the contrary, I hear the same message when I go all across my district. Small businesses and entrepreneurs have a hard time surviving. I hope my Democrat colleagues will also support this common sense adjustment to relieve the undue burden on American families. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a bright new day. Today we begin to deliver real results for the American people by passing legislation to block the Biden administration from unleashing 87,000 new bureaucrats and agents at the IRS on families and small businesses. Last Congress, Democrats voted to supercharge the IRS with $80 billion of taxpayer money focused on IRS enforcement and hiring more auditors to squeeze taxpayers. And it's not just wealthy Americans. With that expanded audit capacity, the IRS can squeeze more money out of middle and lower income families and small businesses as well. The Democrats' American Rescue Plan called for the IRS to require payment apps like Venmo and PayPal to report Americans who made over $600 in transactions. Imagine what 87,000 new agents will do. Republicans want an IRS that works for taxpayers, not targets them. That's why this bill leaves in place the IRS funding for improvements to customer service and technology. Because Americans demand and deserve a government that's accountable not to the powerful but to the people, repealing funding for Biden's army of auditors is a great first step in the right direction. I yield back.
Thank you. I thank my friend from Nebraska. The idea, Mr. Speaker, of hiring 87,000 new IRS agents to close the tax gap is misguided. I served as Revenue Secretary for the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We did, in fact, close the tax gap through what proved to be very effective measures. These included improving IT systems and processes which truly determined tax evasion from tax avoidance, largely taking the easy approach of hiring 87,000 new agents, doubling the size of the IRS. I don't know who thinks that's a good idea. Does not improve the quality of information used to accomplish the goal of collecting all tax revenues that are due. It will only increase the number of audits, most often on innocent small businesses and individuals. As well, the CBO projection of $186 billion of increased revenue was established before the administration said that only those above $400,000 in income would be audited. Currently, nearly 90% of the audits are conducted on small businesses and those making less than $400,000. So how can you make a projection when your targeted audience is reduced by 90%? This is an absolutely flawed plan that will do nothing but increase the size of government, increase audits on law-abiding businesses, and fail to achieve its intended results. It's big government at its worst. According to the CBO, the hiring of these new IRS agents will also cause audit rates to rise on all taxpayers. A bipartisan analysis found that this increase in funding would result in 1.2 million more audits. 700,000 of them will target taxpayers making $75,000 or less. New IRS agents will not be targeting wealthy tax cheats as the claim they will tax everyday Americans.
Gentleman's time has expired. Well, I have a very high opinion of the gentleman from Massachusetts. But what scares me on this bill are the numbers. Okay, right now the IRS has about 78,000 employees, of which about 10,000 are what they describe as agents. It's not surprising that it's less than you had in 1954, because in 1954 everything was computerized, right? Or nothing was computerized. Now the 1099s, the W-2s, they come in and automatically the computers show whether they're on your return or not, and if they're not on the return, you get a letter from the IRS saying you owe X and X amount of money. But now we're going in one bill from 78,000 employees, adding additional 83,000. We have no idea how many of those are going to be agents poking around looking at people, but you've got to figure it's going to be an increase of 5 or 6 times to what they already have. Wisconsin and Massachusetts have states about the same size. You're talking about adding 1,600 employees, assuming it's the same per capita, about 1,600 new employees to Massachusetts and Wisconsin. What the are they going to do with 1,600 new employees? I mean, it's just, I can't imagine. And if you deal with the IRS the way they deal with you, they do things like, well, you owe $20,000, you got to find a lawyer to fight that. Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak in favor of H.R. 23, which would defund the $80 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act, or as I call it, the Inflation Enhancement Act. Thereby, we need to defund the hiring of 87,000 new IRS agents, which would, in effect, double the agency. Nary A1. Now, one of my constituents has asked to hire 87,000 new Border Patrol or IRS agents, but they have asked me, in fact, countless have asked, can we hire 87,000 new Border Patrol agents, Pat? Because there's a crisis and a catastrophe at our southern border. The last thing we want is to double an agency that's already bloated and have them with these 87,000 new agents, or in military parlance, 5 new divisions to harass, stalk, and otherwise terrorize law-abiding American citizens. And who's this going to really kick in the teeth? It's not going to be the wealthy or the poor. It's going to be the small business owners and the middle-class, hardworking Americans. You want to start a new Congress and do it well? This is a great bill, and I urge the passing of H.R. 23, the Small Business and Taxpayer Protection Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am proud to stand here today as a single mother and a small business owner in support of the Family and Small Business Taxpayer Protection Act. One of the most outrageous provisions in the Democrats' hyperpartisan Inflation Reduction Act was giving the IRS $72 billion to hire an additional 87,000 agents. Look, the hiring of 87,000 new IRS agents only squeezes American taxpayers, including small business owners like myself, the backbone of our communities. And my colleagues on the other side, let me tell you this. I live and work and now represent a border district that houses a border patrol sector. They need feet on the ground. They have the same amount of agents on the ground as compared to 3 years ago. Why are you fighting that hard for these agents? Now, the Biden administration will tell you that they've increased agents, but they've only increased agents in the processing and administration, which ultimately has led to the mental health deterioration.
Gentlelady's time
has
expired.
The American people deserve a government that works for them, not against them. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Only in Washington can one defend doubling the size of the IRS and spending $80 billion to hire 87,000 new IRS agents. According to my friends across the aisle, that's a good thing because the billionaires and the millionaires don't pay their fair share. Yet according to the IRS, the top 25% of income earners pay 89% of all income taxes. Does anyone really believe that the 87,000 new IRS agents and employees are going to really stop there? Of course not. How else will the Democrats fund their out-of-control and reckless spending? There aren't enough billionaires and millionaires in the United States to pay for it. My friends on the other side will do what they always do. They'll target hardworking taxpayers, families, and small businesses that are the lifeblood of our economy. It has to stop. Coming from a state like New York, we need to cut taxes. We need to reduce the cost of living and make it more affordable for our hardworking families. I proudly support this legislation and urge all of my colleagues to vote yes and end the 87,000 new IRS agents that are going to terrorize hardworking Americans.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Mr. Speaker, I rise with concern about some of these points that have been raised. I think we've heard it from both sides that IRS is not answering the phone like they should to actually serve the taxpayers who want to do the right thing. It's conceivable that there would be taxpayers overpaying as well because of the complexity in the tax code. And yet, the record shows over the years that there have been innocent taxpayers who already paid what they owed, were still audited, and were considered guilty until they proved themselves innocent. But that, to me, is a huge problem. We just heard that there's concern about the debt, and yet the answer is just more government employees. In fact, more than double of what the current number of employees are. I have huge concerns about that, and that's why I think we need to vote for this bill, get the President and the Senate to agree to this, and work together to focus on customer service issues that everyone knows are a concern at the IRS. So I hope that, again, this use of technology can really lead the way with a goal of customer service rather than just hiring more full-time equivalent employees that I don't think will actually result in the efficiencies that some are claiming that would supposedly raise the revenue that it would. I just think we need to adopt this bill, get this passed, and come together after that, realizing that we can and should expect the IRS to do better. I reserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the conversation that we can have here. I think there is fundamental disagreement on what the real solutions need to be. Although I think there's agreement that the current customer service at the IRS is significantly underperforming. Now, in 2019, in a bipartisan fashion, we passed the Taxpayer First Act. In fact, the highly respected colleague, the late Representative John Lewis, led the way on that as well. This was about customer service and reform at the IRS. Were there benefits from that? COVID got in the way. I think that does actually beg the question of what have been the impacts of COVID on customer service at the IRS. Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned that when there are resources afforded the IRS, they're just not used the way they can and should be, especially as it relates to customer service and the honest taxpayers that my colleague from Massachusetts references. That we want to do everything we can for when the American people are doing the right thing for the right reasons and abiding by the law, and yet they would still be exposed to having to prove themselves again after they already did with voluntary tax compliance. But here comes an audit, and I vividly recall the fact that in the 90s, IRS as an agency overstepped. In fact, I believe it was President Clinton that even pulled back the IRS somewhat because they were going after law-abiding, tax-paying Americans who already did everything they were supposed to do. So that certainly establishes my concern about why we would take legislation, why we would see legislation passed last year that would pretty randomly put forward funding that I think will ultimately get in the way of these tax-paying Americans who, like I said, already did everything they were supposed to do, but yet they have to incur the expense. I urge the passage of this bill for good public policy. Thank you. I yield back.
On this vote, the yeas are 221 and the nays are 210. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Promise is made.